It was a hot summer morning when Ethan Carter entered the Fresno, California, courthouse to face the trial that would change his life forever. The sun was high, and the streets were full of people coming and going, unaware that one man's life was about to be turned upside down. Ethan, a young, hard-working man known for his honesty, never imagined he would end up there, sitting in the defendant's seat, accused of something he didn't commit. The accusation was serious: involvement in a violent robbery of a local jewelry store. The robbery, which occurred months earlier, left the store owner severely injured, and the police quickly sprang into action. The problem was that, for Ethan, it all felt like a nightmare. He wasn't there. He knew nothing about the crime, but the evidence was too clear for him to escape a conviction. Detective Marcus Reed, a man with a peculiar way of doing his job, was the key figure in shaping the case against Ethan. Reed didn't like to lose, and it seemed he was willing to do whatever it took to close the case, leaving no room for error. He had the evidence, or at least, he claimed he did. In the courtroom, Judge Charles Whitaker, a man known for his stern and unyielding demeanor, observed everything carefully. He had seen cases like this before, and, as always, he was ready to follow protocol and ensure justice was served. But what Whitaker didn't know was that he was about to make a decision that would affect a man's life forever. Ethan, sitting in the defendant's seat, felt the weight of the charges on his shoulders. He looked at the judge and saw an impassive expression, as if nothing in his life could shake that man in the dark suit. On the opposite side, the prosecutor presented their version of events: the weapon found at Ethan's house, witnesses who swore they had seen him at the scene of the robbery, and the fact that he had no solid alibi. The story seemed convincing. The jury, made up of ordinary men and women, listened attentively, absorbing every word, as if it were the only truth that mattered. But Ethan knew the truth. He wasn't there. He hadn't committed the crime. So, when it was his turn to speak, he stood up, his voice steady, and declared his innocence. "I didn't do anything," he said, with a conviction even he was starting to question. "I am innocent." But the courtroom was filled with doubt, and his words seemed to echo in the void. Judge Whitaker, unshaken, looked at the defendant. "The court believes in the evidence presented," he said in an authoritative voice, "and that evidence is clear. There is no room for error here." And so, the sentence was handed down. 60 years in prison. Ethan could hardly believe the judge's words. The sentence was as hard a blow as a punch to the stomach. 60 years. He could still taste the bitter defeat in his mouth, but there was nothing he could do about it. There was no way to undo this. Not now, not with the system stacked against him. The jury, silent, didn't seem moved. The prosecutor smiled discreetly, pleased with the victory, while Reed, the detective, wore a look of triumph. They had won. Justice seemed to have been served. But something felt wrong. Something Ethan, trapped in his own reality, still couldn't understand. How had it all happened so fast? How had he, a man with no criminal history, been arrested and sentenced based on a fabricated accusation? As the guards led him back to his cell, the judge's last words still echoed in his mind: "Justice has been served." But for Ethan, that wasn't justice. That was a prison built on lies. Charles Whitaker was not the type of man to be swayed by emotions. When he entered the courtroom that morning, dressed in his dark gray suit, standing tall with his fixed gaze, he seemed like a rock in a sea of uncertainties. There was nothing about him that suggested doubt. For him, the trial was simple. The evidence was on the table, and his job was to ensure that justice was served, with no room for questioning. But as Ethan Carter's case progressed, something began to bother Whitaker, something he couldn't ignore. The confidence he had in the evidence and the witnesses who had convicted Ethan started to erode. Something didn't add up. He didn't know what it was yet, but he felt it. Perhaps it was Ethan himself. The young man seemed so bewildered, so out of place, sitting there waiting to be judged for something he hadn't done. He spoke with such sincerity, such pain in his eyes, that even Whitaker, who had dealt with hundreds of cases, began to question. He, the stern judge, someone who never allowed emotions to mix with judgment, began to feel an inexplicable discomfort. But the reality of the courtroom was unforgiving. The evidence was there, presented by the prosecutor, and it seemed irrefutable. The weapon found at Ethan's house, the witnesses who swore they had seen Ethan at the scene of the robbery, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that Ethan had no clear alibi. There was nothing indicating he wasn't responsible. Whitaker glanced at the defendant again, sitting there, his shoulders heavy with the sentence about to be handed down. He didn't know what it was, But something wasn't right. Still, he had to remain firm. The trial was nearing its end, and he had to give his decision. Based on the evidence presented, Whitaker said in his deep, controlled voice, "This court sentences Ethan Carter to 60 years in prison." And that was it. The case was closed. The courtroom moved on, as if nothing else mattered. But something lingered in the air. A feeling of unease. It wasn't something Whitaker could explain, but it was there, persistent. In the days that followed, as Ethan's case moved to higher courts, Whitaker couldn't stop thinking about it. As a judge, he had a duty to be objective, to not let his own doubts interfere with his decisions. But that didn't stop him from feeling that something was wrong. It was during one of his reviews of the trial that he found a detail, a small detail, but one that stood out like a spark in the darkness. He was going through the case files, the police reports, when he found a piece of information that no one had seemed to pay attention to. The weapon used in the crime, the very same one found at Ethan's house, had already been in police custody before the robbery occurred. Whitaker read the sentence again, with a growing sense of distrust. He looked at the clock and felt the weight of responsibility. This could be an error, but if it were true, it meant the evidence presented against Ethan was wrong. Or worse, it was fabricated. From that moment on, Whitaker's mind couldn't disconnect from the case. He knew he couldn't act impulsively, but something had changed within him. The judge, who had always had unwavering confidence in the justice of the system, was now beginning to question whether the system was truly functioning as it should. Meanwhile, Ethan, in his distant prison cell, still struggled to understand what had happened. He remembered the judge's words, how coldly they had been spoken, sitting in his cell, his hands pressed against the iron bars. He couldn't understand how, after a life of hard work and honesty, he had been sentenced to 60 years. He knew he hadn't committed that crime, but who would believe him? For Whitaker, the following days were marked by a growing sense of unease. He tried to ignore it, tried to stick to his routine, but every time he sat down to review other cases, his mind returned to Ethan Carter. Something was wrong there. He knew it, but he didn't have proof. Not yet. That was when Whitaker made a decision. He needed to investigate. He needed to uncover the truth, even if it meant going against everything he had always believed about the judicial system. He could not, in good conscience, move forward knowing something so important was being overlooked. And so, the judge found himself in an unexpected situation. He, the man who was supposed to be impartial and not be influenced by emotions, was now in search of a truth that could change everything. Something was about to happen, and as much as Whitaker tried to avoid it, he knew his life was about to change too. When Charles Whitaker decided to investigate Ethan Carter's case on his own, he had no idea what he was about to uncover. The judge was not a detective, but instead of ignoring the unease that bothered him, he chose to follow the path of doubt. Something inside him told him there was more to the case than a mere judicial failure. Something deeper, darker, and he needed to understand it. He couldn't live with the doubt of having wrongfully convicted a man. It was at this point that Whitaker contacted Henry Lawson, a retired investigator who, over the years, had developed a reputation for being relentless when it came to exposing frauds and injustices. Lawson, although retired from the police force, still maintained strong contacts and had a sharp instinct for what was wrong. Unlike Whitaker, he didn't mind breaking a few rules to get to the truth. Their first meeting took place at a cafe on the outskirts of Fresno. The place was empty, except for a few tables occupied by workers on the night shift. The smell of fresh coffee and the sound of stirring cups were almost soothing. But Lawson's gaze, fixed and attentive, offered no sense of calm. "So, you believe something's wrong, don't you?" Henry asked, slamming an open file onto the table. He wasn't there to waste time. Whitaker took a deep breath, looking at the document in the folder, the same evidence that had disturbed him so much, the weapon that had been in police custody before the robbery. The judge wasn't sure how that was even possible, but he felt it was a starting point. He looked into Lawson's eyes and said, "The weapon. The police had it before the crime. How can that be? How did no one notice this before?" Lawson smiled, almost ironically. "Because no one wanted to notice, Whitaker. And when it comes to someone like Marcus Reed, what gets lost in small details can be a whole lot more." Whitaker felt a chill. He didn't know much about Marcus Reed, other than what he'd seen in the case reports. The detective seemed competent, even overly efficient. And now he was starting to understand what Lawson meant. There was something more behind Reed. Something beyond just good investigative work. In the following days, Lawson and Whitaker began to delve into a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Ethan's case. Lawson, with his contacts, gained access to documents and testimonies that had been ignored. One of the first signs that something was rotten was the behavior of the witnesses who had accused Ethan. Some, like a man who claimed to have seen Ethan at the crime scene, had changed their stories. But no one had investigated further. Lawson also discovered something that seemed more like a secret than a truth. Reed had been involved in other cases where evidence had been manipulated or discarded. However, due to his position of power within the police, and his ability to make things seem like they always fit, he had escaped any deeper investigation. But the real surprise came when, in a conversation with a former colleague of Reed's, Lawson uncovered a lead about Reed's potential involvement in a network of evidence fabrication. The detective had contacts within the system, people working at various levels of the justice system, and he used these contacts to create false evidence or manipulate existing ones. It was a dirty, well-organized scheme, and now it seemed that Whitaker and Lawson were beginning to uncover the contours of this network. The judge, who had once believed in the integrity of the judicial system, now found himself facing a nightmare, a system corrupted from the inside out. Whitaker, with his sense of duty and loyalty to the law, felt the pressure building. He had helped convict an innocent man, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Corruption was everywhere inside the police force, in the courts, and even among some of the people he respected. The two continued their investigation, tracking Reed's movements, combing through his files, and checking witnesses who had been convinced to lie or, worse, threatened. They discovered that some of the evidence presented in Ethan's trial had been tampered with, possibly without the knowledge of the prosecutor. Reed was playing a dangerous game, and the corruption network extended far beyond him. Whitaker could no longer sleep properly. He stayed up late into the night, reading documents and trying to connect the dots. With each new piece of information that came to light, he felt the weight of guilt growing heavier on his shoulders. As a judge, he had the power to correct this mistake, but that meant confronting a terrifying truth. Corruption had infiltrated every level of justice, and by trying to fix it, he knew he was putting his own career at risk. The judge, however, no longer had a choice. He was caught between loyalty to his profession and the moral compass that now screamed in his conscience. He needed to dig deeper. He had to find a way to expose this network, even knowing he would face fierce resistance. Meanwhile, in his cell, Ethan Carter continued to wonder how his life had turned into a nightmare. He knew something was wrong with his case, but like everyone else, he didn't understand the extent of the corruption that had imprisoned him. When Charles Whitaker started digging deeper, his work became more dangerous than he had imagined. The judge wasn't sure how far he was willing to go, but what he was discovering left no room for doubt. The corruption he was beginning to uncover wasn't isolated. It was something with deep roots that, if exposed, could bring down much of the justice system in Fresno, maybe even the entire state. The threat started subtly. First, it was an anonymous phone call, with a hoarse voice and a threatening tone. "You know what you're doing, don't you? Wake up, Whitaker. You're messing with powerful people." The warning had no name, but its intention was clear. Stop the investigation. Whitaker wasn't intimidated, but he began to notice that with every step he took, the resistance became more visible. The system, which he had always believed to be strong and impartial, was now showing its vulnerabilities. Someone behind the curtains was trying to keep things in place, and that someone had power. It was then that the judge felt for the first time that he was stepping into a territory he might not be able to leave without paying a price. The worst moment came a month later, when an investigation that seemed straightforward turned into a direct threat to his safety. Whitaker was reviewing a report on falsified evidence, and when he tried to access more details, he encountered an unusual block in the judicial system. The files had disappeared. In place of important documents, there was a simple but clear message: "If you continue, you'll regret it." It was hard to tell if that was just a warning or an attempt to intimidate him, but the judge felt the weight of it on his shoulders. Every piece of information he was gathering seemed to be swallowed by an invisible force. He wasn't just facing a network of corruption anymore. He was up against an entire system that was willing to fight against him. Meanwhile, Henry Lawson, the retired investigator, had been more direct. He knew he was risking a lot by collaborating with Whitaker. Lawson had friends and former colleagues in high places, and many of them started distancing themselves from him when he got involved in the investigation. Some called him crazy. Others said he was meddling where he shouldn't. But Lawson was determined. He had always believed that the truth had to come out, no matter who was trying to hide it. One night, in Lawson's makeshift office, The first real blow came. They were reviewing transcripts of recorded conversations from Marcus Reed, obtained through an anonymous source. It was sensitive, compromising material. The conversation they were listening to between Reed and an informant left no doubt that something was very wrong. They were dealing with a scheme of evidence, manipulation and bribery, involving people within the police force itself. But as Whitaker and Lawson listened to those recordings, the office door was kicked in. The sound of the doors being forced open was deafening. Lawson's first reaction was to stand up, but it was already too late. They were surrounded. Men, in dark suits, with no identification, entered swiftly and began tearing everything apart. Whitaker, who had hidden behind a bookshelf, was breathing heavily. He knew this was serious. These men were there to find anything that could incriminate them, and if necessary, destroy everything. It was no longer just a matter of investigating a case now, it was a matter of life or death for them. Lawson, with his pragmatic approach, knew that the only thing that could save both of them was staying calm. He quickly grabbed the recording and hid it in a secret drawer he had installed a long time ago for cases like this. What they were listening to could be the key to everything, but they had to get out of there alive first. After what felt like an eternity, the men left without taking anything. Whitaker and Lawson were both sweating and tense. The feeling of being watched at every step wouldn't leave them. They knew that if they continued the investigation, the risks would increase exponentially. But the judge, though frightened, also knew he couldn't stop now. The truth was within reach, and he couldn't abandon Ethan Carter and himself along the way. The resistance was now clearer than ever. The physical threats, the destruction of evidence, and the constant surveillance weren't just signs that someone wanted to keep the corrupt system intact. They were being hunted, not because they were wrong, but because they were close to exposing a network of power that many would try to protect at any cost. Whitaker and Lawson were now at a point of no return. The only way out was to move forward, more cautious, but more determined than ever. The system was fighting back, but the judge and the retired investigator had already made a decision. If they needed to fight against all the powerful figures in Fresno to expose the truth, they would do it. The price to pay was already clear, but what they were about to reveal could change everything. The truth was finally beginning to emerge, but, as always, it did not come without a fight. For Charles Whitaker, this was not a moment of celebration, but of relief and a deep fear of what might happen next. He knew he was touching something that could bring down the very structure of the justice system in Fresno, and perhaps even beyond. But the decision had been made. He and Lawson had taken the first step to expose the corruption that had silenced the truth for so long. The biggest turn came when investigative journalist Rachel McDowell entered the picture. She was known for her courageous and often risky reporting. Rachel had built a reputation for diving deep into cases that most journalists feared to touch. She had a network of reliable sources and a sharp instinct for finding cracks in what seemed solid. Whitaker met her at a cafe in downtown Fresno, a simple place with only a few people. The ideal environment for a private conversation. She was skeptical at first, as any good journalist would be. "Are you sure about what you're saying, Judge? We're talking about something big here. Are you willing to risk your career and your life?" Whitaker didn't respond immediately. He knew that if Rachel was going to get involved, she had to be completely convinced that the evidence was real. He spent hours with her, explaining everything he had uncovered. The manipulated evidence, all the witnesses forced to lie, and Marcus Reed's increasingly suspicious behavior. He laid it all out, leaving nothing out. When Whitaker finished, Rachel sat in silence for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and said, "If what you're saying is true, this is a national scandal. Are you telling me that a Fresno police detective was behind an entire network of evidence falsification? This is bigger than any case I've ever covered." And that's how, in an act of courage, Rachel McDowell agreed to help. She understood the risks, but also knew that the opportunity to expose something this large was rare. With Lawson's help, they managed to access secret documents that indicated how Reed had manipulated investigation records and even bribed some key witnesses. The first big twist came when Rachel secured a meeting with a former police officer who had worked with Reed. He, clearly afraid of being identified, provided vital information about how evidence was planted and investigations were directed to frame innocent people. This officer, who had been removed from the force due to suspicious behavior, knew that if he didn't speak out, his life would never be the same. But at the same time, he understood that his revelation could bring down an entire network. Rachel secretly recorded the conversation. It was risky, but she knew it was a key piece to bring everything to light. With that in hand, she continued to dig for more evidence, relentlessly. She delved into investigations, spoke with other officers, and even defense lawyers who had dealt with suspicious cases related to Reed. Every conversation, every meeting, added more pieces to the puzzle. The turning point came when, during a press conference, Rachel revealed what she had uncovered. She not only exposed Reed's involvement, but also directly tied him to Ethan Carter's case. The journalist revealed that the weapon used in Ethan's trial had already been in police custody before the robbery, a discovery Whitaker had made months earlier, but one that no one had paid attention to until then. The public pressure was immediate. Within hours, authorities began to be questioned. Ethan's case was reopened, and for the first time since his conviction, he was given the chance to be heard. Rachel's revelation was the spark that ignited a fire that no one could control anymore. The press took over, spreading the scandal beyond Fresno's borders. Marcus Reed's name was tarnished, and his involvement in evidence manipulation was widely discussed in the news. Whitaker, though relieved to finally see the truth come to light, knew the fight was just beginning. Reed, no matter how much he was being exposed, would not surrender easily. He had allies, people inside the system, who could still try to block the progress of the investigations. And more importantly, the truth now carried a much heavier weight. With each new detail that surfaced, the pressure mounted. Reopening Ethan's case was a victory, but a temporary one. The court that had convicted Ethan would now be forced to reconsider the new evidence and reevaluate its sentence. Whitaker knew this wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be fast, but it was what needed to be done. The big question was, how would Reed react? Was he panicking? Was he ready to destroy the evidence that incriminated him? Or would he try to use his position to play even dirtier? The judge felt a mix of satisfaction and concern. The truth was out in the open, but the system was still fortified by people willing to do anything to protect it. And he knew that for Ethan, the real battle was just beginning. The legal battles were only the start. Meanwhile, Ethan, still incarcerated, could hardly believe that, after all this time, there was finally a chance for his story to be heard. What had once seemed impossible was now becoming real. He, who had been considered guilty without mercy, was beginning to glimpse freedom. But deep down, he knew the true fight was just beginning. The courtroom where Ethan Carter had been sentenced to 60 years in prison had now become the stage for a dramatic reversal. But the hearing room, once a place of defeat and helplessness, was about to be transformed into a space of justice. The new evidence, which had emerged like a storm, made the case even more complex and more dangerous for those who had tried to keep the justice system in Fresno as it was. Charles Whitaker, the judge who had sentenced Ethan, was now on the other side of the scale. He was no longer seated in his position of authority, making decisions based on evidence and testimony he believed to be genuine. He was on the front lines of the battle, fighting for the truth he had ignored. And it wasn't just his position. At stake, the new investigations and proof that Rachel McDowell had exposed to the world had made such an impact that the entire judicial system was being challenged. On the day of the hearing that reopened Ethan's case, the courtroom was packed. Lawyers, journalists, police officers, and even curious citizens filled the benches. The tension was palpable not only because Ethan was there, finally getting a chance to defend himself, but also because of the expectation that the truth would finally come to light. Everyone knew this trial was not just about one man wrongfully convicted, but about something much bigger: the integrity of the judicial system. When Judge Whitaker entered the room, it immediately fell silent. His presence, now that he had become part of the story he was trying to correct, was heavy. He was no longer in his position of impartiality. Now, he was personally involved in the case, and everyone, him included, knew that the future of this trial could mean a new era of justice, or the complete dismantling of everything he believed was right. Ethan's defense attorney, a man named Peter Owens, stood with confidence, but his tone carried a determination that reflected the gravity of the moment. He had worked tirelessly to gather all the necessary evidence to overturn Ethan's conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, "today we are here to correct a grotesque mistake. Ethan Carter, who was convicted of a crime he never committed, now has the chance to finally present the evidence that was ignored in the original trial." Owens glanced at Judge Whitaker, who sat with his arms crossed, trying to hide the anguish on his face. He knew that his position as a judge was now being questioned by his own conscience. He knew that Ethan's case had been poorly judged, but now, more than ever, he needed to make a decision that reflected the truth. Not his pride, Next to Owens were the documents and recordings that Rachel McDowell had collected. The journalist, who was not present in the courtroom, had provided the defense attorney with all the information about the evidence manipulation and falsified testimonies. What she had revealed to the world was not just a piece of information, it was the key to unlocking the door to the truth. The first witness called was the retired police officer who, in an act of courage, had decided to speak out about the internal corruption within the Fresno police. He climbed onto the platform with a cautious look, fully aware of the risks he was taking, but with a clear conscience for finally doing what was right. "I was there at the time," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I saw with my own eyes how the evidence was manipulated, how Marcus Red, the detective himself, directed the falsification of evidence to incriminate Ethan. I was part of that. And I'm here today to correct the wrong." His words hung in the air. The courtroom was completely silent. The impact of what he had said was immense. And those present, including the journalists, the attorneys, and even Judge Whittaker, knew that what was being revealed was not just a mistake made. It was a structural failure, a deep-rooted evil. Within the system, the corruption was not an accident. It was a deliberate plan. When Marcus Reed was finally called to testify, the tension in the room increased. The detective, once seen as a local hero for solving crimes, was now in the position of the accused. He entered the room with his head down, an expression of repressed anger on his face, as if he were trying to maintain control. But no one there was fooled. They all knew what he represented. "Do you deny the charges against you?" Owens asked. Firmly, Reed lifted his head, glaring at the attorney with disdain. "These are baseless accusations," he replied, trying to maintain his arrogant stance. "I've always worked within the law. This is an attempt to destroy my career." But the evidence was clear. The recording made by Rachel McDowell, in which Reed instructed others to alter the records in Ethan's case, was presented as evidence. The courtroom grew even tenser as everyone watched the recording of Reed speaking with an informant, discussing how to manipulate Ethan's case and secure his conviction. Reed's face turned pale as he heard his own voice, incriminating himself. And finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Ethan Carter, the man who had been wrongfully convicted, was called to speak. He stepped up to the platform, still with handcuffs on his wrists, but with his head held high. What would he say, after so many years of suffering, of injustice? How did he feel now that his chance to prove his innocence had finally arrived? "I never committed the crime I was accused of," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I spent years in prison, lost, waiting for a chance. But no one listened to me. No one believed me. To this day, the pain of knowing my life was destroyed by a lie, that will never go away. I just want everyone to know that I am not the monster they painted me to be." Ethan's words resonated in the courtroom. They weren't just a defense of his own innocence. They were a cry for justice, a message of hope for those who, like him, were being silenced by a system that failed them. And in that moment, Judge Whittaker, looking at the man he had condemned, knew that the only thing left to do was correct the mistake he had made. The courtroom was about to decide, and the truth was finally ready to be heard. It was a cold autumn morning in Fresno when the prison gates opened for Ethan Carter. After more than 5 years of wrongful conviction, he was finally released. But the relief of seeing the daylight again was not the only emotion that dominated his heart. He felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, fear, gratitude, and a quiet rage for everything that had been taken from him. Freedom was there, but it didn't bring back the lost years, nor the man he had been before, being dragged into this nightmare. Ethan left the prison with his hands still trembling. His body was physically stronger than when he entered, but his mind was scarred. He looked at the clear blue sky of Fresno, took a deep breath, and felt the cold breeze on his face. The world he once knew no longer existed. He had been condemned, forgotten. But now he was free. Finally, waiting for him was his mother, a woman who had aged while fighting for a son she knew was innocent. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. She ran to him, hugging him with a strength that seemed impossible for someone who had lived so long with the weight of pain. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice hoarse, filled with emotion. "I knew." Ethan couldn't respond with words, only with a tight hug, a silent way of thanking the woman who never gave up on him. He knew that, as important as it was for him to be there, that moment was just as meaningful for her as it was for him. Meanwhile, across the city, Charles Whittaker, the judge who had convicted Ethan, and later helped expose the corruption that led to his imprisonment, sat alone in his office. The room was empty, with only the light from a lamp above his desk illuminating the space. He was not celebrating the victory that others might imagine. For him, Ethan's release was not a celebration, but a constant reminder of his own failure. He sat in his chair, staring at the stack of papers on his desk. It was all part of a system he believed to be just, but, looking back, he knew it was broken. He knew that, at some point, the pieces had been there, but he hadn't seen them. Ethan's mistake, the conviction based on lies, was failure, the failure of a man who should have seen the signs, should have investigated further. He couldn't stop thinking about those years, about the time Ethan had spent behind bars. Now, more than ever, he understood that one mistake didn't just affect one person's life. It affected the whole society, shattered trust in the institutions, destroyed the faith that the justice system was meant to uphold. Whitaker didn't know what would become of his career after everything that had happened. He had taken the brave step of reopening the case, of aligning himself with people like Henry Lawson and Rachel McDowell, exposing the corruption within the system. But he knew that this didn't erase the fact that he had been responsible for Ethan's wrongful conviction. His name was now marked forever, part of a story he could not rewrite. As Whitaker reflected on all of this, the city of Fresno began to change. The scandal involving Marcus Reed and the network of corruption within the police hadn't dissipated. On the contrary, it had sparked a wave of reforms that was beginning to sweep through the local justice system. People began to question more openly what had once seemed like unquestionable authority. The trust in the institutions, which had been shattered, was slowly beginning to rebuild, step by step. Ethan's case, in a way, had been the spark that ignited this movement. And the man at the center of that spark, Ethan Carter, now wanted more than just his freedom. He wanted to make sure his experience would be the foundation for something bigger, something that would help prevent others from going through the same hell. With the support of his mother and Rachel McDowell, who had continued to fight for justice, Ethan began working on a prisoners' rights advocacy organization. His mission was to help those who, like him, had been wrongfully convicted, those whose lives had been destroyed by failures in the justice system. He didn't want anyone else to go through what he had, and he knew this was a fight that wouldn't end with his release, but one he was willing to continue. He would become a voice for those who couldn't defend themselves. He would help overturn wrongful sentences, show the world that the system could be reformed. But, above all, he needed to find peace within himself. He needed to understand how to move forward, how to rebuild after years of suffering. Meanwhile, Charles Whitaker was also rebuilding. The pain of guilt still consumed him, but he knew he couldn't go back. He could try to change the system from within, trying to correct the errors he had made, attempting to reform the very justice system he had spent so long protecting. He joined activists, human rights advocates, and other judges who shared the vision that the system needed a radical change. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused to Ethan, but he could ensure it didn't happen again. The story of Ethan and Whitaker was, ultimately, a story of rebuilding lives, careers, and flawed systems. But it was also a story of hope, that, even after the worst nightmare, the possibility of redemption still existed. People had the courage to fight for the truth. And for Ethan, that fight was just beginning.